It seems to me that the main hindrance of Ara,
Maryuuin Kouga Saigo no Tatakai,
lies not within what explicitly happens in it, but in the overall progression of it. What I mean by this is that there isn't really a firm grasp on what exactly the major conflict is until over 40 minutes into a film that's barely 80 minutes long. It's not that they were really wasting time up until then, it's just that the movie takes its time to ease us into what's going on so as to better understand what exactly the protagonists are doing. I feel like if Ichirou outright stated something along the lines of, "I used to pretend I was the main character of a JRPG," early on, then the story would lose a lot of its impact. One of the intentions of keeping the exposition really slow here was sort of to show the appeal of daydreaming or fantasy, since at the beginning it isn't outright stated that Ryouko is just pretending to be some kind of mage, which makes her seem much cooler than a loser who likes to think she's a fantasy character. The interesting thing about this is that there's still enough hints to understand what's really going on from the beginning, such as how Ryoko's staff looks kind of crappy and she can still be seen by others despite her claiming that she can't be seen by humans. This lack of exposition in order to produce a certain effect through assuming the audience will perceive an informationless situation in a certain way is used in a different way here from how it is used in Lane and arguably Zegapane. It was used in Lane to lead us along a specific character's point of view in order to call into question the larger theme of reality and coherent passage of time. Ara doesn't do that, and instead it places the audience along a point of view that isn't really aligned with any specific character. It's comparable to some phantom outside viewer who knows nothing about the situation. It's questionable if this really helps add to any sort of idea the story has in the same way Lane did because of its disassociation with anything material in the story, but I still believe this method is more effective than just telling the audience what is going on from the beginning. It's this method that contributes to a lot of the doubts I had about this movie initially. Since it isn't exactly clear what Ryoko's character is supposed to be at first, it may be hard to like or understand what the intention of her character is. I don't believe I gave this character enough credit when I first watched this movie, as at the time she just seemed like an annoying nerd girl that sometimes lacks confidence. This relates to the first concern I had with her, which was, why does she like Ichirou? This is kind of a silly thing to misinterpret, since this is actually made pretty clear at the beginning of the movie. It's because Ichirou directly states that he doesn't mind her, and how he has an interest in fantasy-like stuff unlike most people. Still, this calls into question why she doesn't care for the other fantasy-stricken weirdos in the story, as she barely seems to acknowledge their existence. In this case, it isn't really a question of Ryoko's characterization, more of the lack of characterization of those other kids. The second question I had about her character was why she was bothered by the writing on her desk yet was completely unfazed by everyone's negative perception of her up until that point. I actually like how she handles these sort of situations in the story, as I believe her explanation of her being invisible to humans isn't meant to imply that she's pretending to be literally invisible, rather that she means she is impervious to negative perception towards her. Still, this doesn't really explain why she would react so strongly to words on her desk and not any verbal insults thrown directly towards her. Maybe this is because it was forced upon her in such a heavy, persistent fashion instead of being easily ignorable words that disappear as soon as they're said. But that's mostly my own explanation and not really implied in the actual movie, so you can't undoubtedly say that that's the case. I initially didn't like Ryouko because it seemed like she was a character who overloads her speech with high language simply because she wants to and for no other particular reason. Upon rewatching some of her dialogue, it gave me the impression that the actual reason she talks like that is to distract herself from her issues. The reason I believe this is because of her persistent interaction with Ichirou and how she will still disagree with him or try to force him into a certain mindset, meaning she is far from lacking in agency. It's difficult to explain why exactly this led me to see her that way, as it's mostly an intuitional inference based on knowledge of similar cases. So I guess that means either it's something where a certain mindset causes the thought, or I'm just really bad at explaining this type of thing. I find Ichirou's character to be difficult to follow, as at times it isn't clear why he does certain things. For example, I wasn't really sure why his mind changed about Ryouko so quickly early on in the movie, though I guess it's because at this time he learns she is just pretending to be magical. This is where not knowing what's going on for at least half the movie hurts, because it's hard to understand why Ichirou does a lot of the things he does at this point, making him seem like he's being an asshole for no reason. One of the major elements that prevents Ara from being exceptional is how the antagonists act towards the main characters. At times they seem overly rash or mean for no apparent reason, which is not exactly off-putting in concept. There's nothing really wrong with characters opposing the protagonists in an emotional manner, but the way it is shown and the context around it are especially important in the overall tone they exhibit. I feel this is where the movie faults majorly, since the antagonists don't appear to have a rational reason for disliking the main characters so much other than that they hate people who act differently from them. Obviously there's droves of real people that are assholes simply because they're bigots or irrationally hate variation, but that doesn't mean that it would be a good idea to include them as a story character. It's characters like these that veer into the territory of being very emotionally manipulative in how they act. The excessive amount of yelling and rudeness the antagonists commit doesn't really add anything and instead feels like it's overblowing things for the sake of overblowing things. If they seemed more reasonable in how they acted, or we were shown more of the reasoning behind their actions, it would make these characters feel more three-dimensional and less emotionally manipulative. The final scene of the movie is a bit melodramatic and ridiculous. Surely the most questionable thing of the entire situation is, how did Ryouko set up all those desks there like that by herself on top of a public building? Besides, it seems especially important that this movie, which focuses heavily on people who cannot accept reality, should veer away from unrealism such as this as much as it can so as to better support its own ideas. The desks aren't that big of a deal, but they do make this final scene a bit harder to take seriously. I like this ending for what it means at least, as the characters learn to see things from not just one side or the other, but to meet it at a middle ground. Ichirou stops shunning his fantasy side and learns to accept it while also keeping touch with reality. The way Ryouko's mind is changed is kind of hard to believe, as it's done by Ichirou dressing up as his fantasy persona and explaining that he once indulged in fantasy but had to give it up. It's generally difficult to understand a change of mind in a character whose thoughts can't be heard anyway, and I had the same problem with Persona 3 and 4 where characters would change their minds without you understanding exactly what the thought process was they went through to make that decision. But that's not really too much of an issue there or in Ara, since not all stories would work well if we could directly understand the thought process of every character. Perhaps it's still the narrative's fault for not showing the thought process more clearly through outer monologue or something. My main concern is if Ichirou's explanation to her was never heard by her before. Assuming it was, why did it just now happen to change her mind, taking into account her consideration of suicide at the time? It could all be chalked up to because Ichirou specifically did it, as he was the reason she intended to kill herself in the first place, so I guess it does make sense since it allows her to be reminded that he actually cares about her. I'd imagine if not for its weak supporting characters and odd pacing, that Ara would be far more exceptional, but as it stands it's unique and well thought out, though not enough for me to have already heard about it years before I actually watched it.